Thank you. Again,
thank you,
thank
Chairman.
you for your support last year, and I look forward to it continuing.
Thank you, members, and congratulations on your reappointment for 4 years.
Thank you, sir. Which I've got to come to my announcements now, if I can find the right bit of paper. It's much more complicated than it is at home. I've got 4 things to say. I'd like to welcome 3 new members, Jez Myers, Graham Wilson and Mike Sargent. And as I said in the prelim, I'll be in contact and we can get to know each other a little better. And I think I'd like the minutes to record the thanks to the departing members who were with us last year, which was Nick Sanford, Mike Davey and Mark Belsack. We had an induction session yesterday, which most of us were able to join in. I found it useful, even though I've been sitting in this chair for 4 years, and I hope those who attended did, and those who were unable to be there. It's well worth finding the time, particularly from the facilitator, Beth, because it's a good reminder of our role and some of many of the issues we have to bear in mind. And if you can get substitutes to find a bit of time, that would also be nice. Suresh Patel, who is has been our external auditor for the 4 years that we've been in existence, is leaving EY shortly. He's going back to his old firm, Mazars, as a partner. So I thank him for all the advice and help he's given the committee and wish him well. But he has also pledged to take us through to the end of this year's audit. So we will see him again when we get the opinion. But thank you, Suresh. And my last point I wanted to make is I had a very useful virtual meeting yesterday with the new mayor, and I was delighted to learn of his attitude about this committee, which is hugely positive. And he made the point that in his medical profession, he has seen the value firsthand of good internal controls, procedures, and audit. So we have somebody that we can look to if we come to a material which is causing us to concern. And he readily agreed to come and join us at a meeting whenever we invite him. For the new members, what we normally have done in the past is that once a year we ask the mayor to come for the opening of a meeting so he can bring us up to date in his thinking, and we have the opportunity to question him. So that'll be at some time in the new year. So that was very positive. I talked to the mayor about some of the things that have been in our work programme, and those who were with us last year will know that we had some strong opinions about openness and transparency, and particularly the presumption, which we recommended should be changed at the business board. The presumption that it should be open unless the chair decides to hold it in private, whereas at the moment it's the other way around. It's in private unless the chair decides to open. And the chair of the business board is coming to see us, I think, at our next meeting, so we can talk about this. But the mayor was very supportive to the thinking that came out of this committee about openness in that context. So we could bear that in mind when we meet the business board next year. So those are my announcements. We go on now to the minutes of the last meeting. For those of us who were there, are we happy to take it as a record?
Yeah. Yes.
Fine. And are any comments on no syntactical errors, or everything's fine? Good. Right. Well, let's go to the action log. And you'll see there's 2 versions of the action log in the papers, but if I bring you to page 19, which is the new approach that the scrutiny officer has developed to draw to our attention the actions from before and to put their provenance. And the long list that precedes that in the papers today will not appear in future. It will be something in this format. So So are there any comments on the action list from anybody? Okay, I just have one, and it really goes back to the issue of the business board chair. I think the wording is we don't recommend that the meetings be held in public. We recommend that the presumption should be the meetings are held in public. If we could just amend that, that would be very kind. But I don't think I had any more points on that. So we'll now go to the internal audit progress report, which John Alsop is going to introduce, but we should have the RSM lead, Dan, or is it Jay, coming to talk to us? Can we put him on the screen? Do we have him? Good morning, Dan. Welcome.
Good morning.
So, John, Head of Finance, you're going to introduce the paper before.
It's really just to introduce Dan Harris, our internal auditors. So Dan's our chief internal auditor.
Chair is yours, Dan.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning, everyone. I will take you to the section headed up number 1, key messages within our progress report paper. So just more so for the benefit of new members to the committee, we produce a progress report to pretty much every meeting that you have, and there's a twofold purpose to the progress report. One is to give you an update on where we are with the respective year's programme of internal audit coverage. The second fold purpose is that I would also update you if there were any significant issues arising from the work that might end up in a qualification to our year-end opinion. So I'm pleased to report under that sort of key messages section that we have now completed the internal audit programme for 2021, and 4 reports specifically have been finalised since the last meeting, and the 2 reports remain in draft, and they should be final reports by the time we get to your meeting at the end of July. So at the July meeting, I'll bring the further 2 reports, and indeed my annual report, which includes my opinion for the year ended 31st of March 21. I've also just put a line in there just in terms of commentary. So the 21-22 programme of work was also agreed at the last Audit and Governance Committee meeting. We're in discussion just in terms of all of the timelines and the respective scopes for those reviews, but we've not yet sort of formally commenced that plan of work. But if I can take you on then just in terms of sort of section 2 of the report, and again just for the benefit of new committee members, what we've agreed with the chair and with the committee is that where we issue a positive opinion through our internal audit reports, you will see the executive summaries within this progress update paper. So if it's a substantial assurance or indeed a reasonable assurance, you will just receive the executive summary. And pleasing to note that the 4 final reports that we've got on today's agenda under section 2, they were all positive opinions. So we've got a reasonable assurance there for the appointments to boards and committees review, the accounts payable review, and the COVID-19 capital grants reviews. And the follow-up review, that was where we looked at a sample of actions that had been agreed previously and we give that a rating as to whether there's been good, reasonable, poor or little progress. So again, it's pleasing to note that of the 9 actions we looked at as part of that review, 7 had been fully implemented and 2 had actually been superseded since that they were originally made. So I think what I'm saying at this stage is, for the 4 reports presented today, that they are all positive opinions. So hence you've just got the abbreviated findings contained within your pack. We then just go on to Appendix A. Again, for new committee members, what Appendix A is showing is that was the complete programme of work that was agreed by the committee, and that's the overarching view. So you previously received the findings from the risk management review. We've got the 4 in bold shown on that Appendix A that I'm presenting today, and then it's the 2 other draft reports that will come through to your July meeting. We're just working through the action plans with officers ahead of finalising those reports. I think the only other thing to say, Chair, was just there's been a client briefing update we've issued just at the end of the progress report. Hopefully self-explanatory, but what that is just pointing to is a slight change in the sort of the wording for our lowest level of opinion that we're providing. So we've removed the reference to no assurance, and that's been replaced with a minimal assurance opinion. So that's the sort of the red rated assurance level. But yeah, that's from the 21-22 programme onwards. But more than happy to take any questions on the progress report if there are any.
Okay, thank you very much, Dan. Are there... Mike Sargent.
Thank you, Chair. In terms of the capital grants, it was good that it was a fairly positive report, but I'm interested in the level of fraud, because we're aware that with some of the COVID grants, there's been high levels of fraud. So in terms of how we've approached capital grants, I don't know if this is an issue for you, but perhaps somebody else can comment whether we're in line with the level of fraud in terms of capital grants. And the other thing, John, was I'm not aware of what the future work programme is, and I couldn't find it in the report, so it would be useful to know what that is.
Dan, did you hear that?
Yes, I did, Chair. So in terms of the future work programme, I'm wondering, Council, whether the best bet might be to, well, I can either email that out to you. The alternative is that it should be on the Combined Authority website under the papers for the last meeting. The in full was in that paper. But alternatively, I can email that out. So that's not a problem one way or the other. We can get that information to you. I think what I would say, just in terms of, I mean, I'm happy for obviously for John to come in, but what we've undertaken, sort of testing that we've undertaken during the grant audit, moving on to your first question. We have looked at a range of areas that would be designed, so a number of the controls in place would be designed to obviously ensure that the potential for fraudulent claims was absolutely minimised. And what I would say is that our testing was designed to ensure that indeed those controls were designed appropriately to minimise that opportunity, and indeed that they had been complied with. So we looked at everything from the guidance that had gone out to the scheme assessors to the public engagement campaign in relation to the capital grant scheme guidance, and actually sort of getting the publicity out there, that there were strict criteria, and that criteria was being adhered to when it was processed. that supporting evidence was available in line with all of the scheme criteria, that grant offer letters supported all of the information within the application, that the grant claim was completed correctly, that all of the associated evidence was submitted with that, that the approvals process and was being adhered to by the respective specialists that were looking at that. And then we also looked at the, so there was a tracking spreadsheet in place recording details of all of the expenditure that had been made. And finally, we then looked at the respective reporting through to the business board. So that just gives you a little bit more sense of what we looked at, and indeed a number of those controls that we looked at, both in terms of a design perspective and a compliance perspective, should provide some assurance to the committee that they were robust and in the main were being adhered to and were being followed. So I hope that provides a bit more context.
Thank you, Dan. Do you have any comments as Chief Finance Officer?
Just add, I guess, that the team who were administering the COVID grants, the same team that administer the usual grants that the combined authority are responsible for. So it was just a couple of additional grants, and there was one which was refocused towards COVID or businesses affected by COVID. We also brought in some additional resource to provide due diligence in what we were doing as well. So it was a team that had previous experience of doing similar work. We provided additional resource, and there is, as far as we're aware, there's been no recorded instance of any fraud that's either attempted or succeeded within the scheme. So,
okay. There's a follow-up.
Yeah,
Because I've got two other people to come.
John, I just would have expected in this report to say what the future
No, and
was. I think in future we do need to have
yeah, and I
the
think
current and the future in this, so we don't have to go off.
yeah, I think it's very, very good, and it's remembering that it's a turnover year. Dan,
Yes.
are we there? I think can you in future reports include the future work programme as an annex, or so that we can have it in front of us?
Yeah, no, I absolutely, Chair. To be fair, sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, I can.
Yeah, sorry. So, yes, apologies for that. We would ordinarily include that in the papers. I think because this was a backward-looking progress report, it was predominantly completing the programme of work. It's why it's not in there, but I'll absolutely make sure that for future meetings, starting with the next one in July, that we incorporate the forward-looking programme as well as any work we've finished off for 2021.
Thank you, Dan. Graham?
Thank you. I was mainly signaling because I couldn't hear what people on the other side were saying. I'm not absolutely clear. Am I supposed to have that on my?
Okay.
Or do I just talk?
We only have the two microphones. Is that how this works?
Everybody has microphones, but they're all going out to the stream. So everyone, normally, two big ones are what's going out into the room, and bring others in at a lower level, but they're so small, they're really there only for the stream.
So I need to project.
Just make sure if you can project, that would help.
Okay.
Well, at least I know.
Do you want John to say anything?
No, once Johnny got going.
Okay.
You can
Okay. Well, those those are our marching orders then. Project.
Project. Okay, well, I will do my actual bit of project. So the main issue about Dan's report was about the appointments to boards and committees and the weaknesses identified in the overarching governance controls. I understand what the issues are. I just wonder what actions are now being taken to confirm that the current board and all the constitutional groups are getting their register of interests and code of conduct forms in.
So it's quite a
Projection.
I think the microphone assists me. That was a very specific and helpful indication from the audit report there, and it's just allowed us as a governance team just to redouble our efforts to get documentation back. We're slightly in the hands of others because it does depend upon those who have been asked to complete forms to return them, and we can't obviously force that, but we can diarise regular chasing and reviews. So we're certainly doing that as a matter of course.
Are we naming and shaming?
We're yet to do that, but we try to encourage positively through the democratic services teams that we work with, and I think we recognise how busy members are, but we're yet to do that. It may be that in a given committee instance that we ask the chair to encourage as well in due course.
Are we squeaky clean, members? We put in our form on registration of interests?
I don't think I have yet, but I'm not sure if I've been asked.
Well, we won't name and shame, but if you haven't, please do it forthwith. Shaz.
Thank you, Chair. First question, I've got three questions if I may. First one's for Dan. You said that the assurance level has changed from no assurance to minimal assurance. And I wanted to know what prompted that particular change, and is minimal assurance the standard requirement for this type of setup?
Dan, did you hear that?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch all of that.
Which we're asking, what was the reasoning from going from no assurance to minimal assurance? And sorry, what was it?
And is minimal assurance the standard requirement for this
And
type
is
of
that
setup?
the standard? Is that a standard now, a standard requirement in internal audit, or is that result of your own company's analysis?
It's the latter, Chair. I think, to be fair, we have responded to a range of feedback that we have received across the board from our clients, insofar as it is very unusual, if I'm honest, where you get to a position where you can provide no assurance whatsoever on an area that you are auditing. What you sometimes will find is there are at least some controls in place. You might still identify very significant findings. So it's that concept we've sometimes had, if I'm honest, around selling an opinion that is described as no assurance. So that's the reason we moved away from that following a review by our technical team, but it's predominantly from feedback that we've received from our clients. But it's very much each firm, or if it was an in-house internal audit team, it's very much sort of down to the respective firm or team and head of audit to determine what the assurance levels are. I think in reality, what the committee will clearly see is that on sort of page 31 of your packs, you're hopefully left in no doubt as to a minimal level of assurance being the worst sort of assurance rating that we can provide to you through our work.
And the second part of the question is that under standard or this type of setup?
Yes, I mean it is. It's a standard. A number of the firms, and indeed a number of in-house local authority teams, do have a level of assurance, often with 2 being positive, 2 being negative. I mean, this is fully compliant with the public sector internal audit standards, which is your sort of contract with us requires us to meet those public sector internal audit standards, and it is very much in line with those standards.
Okay. And I can see the logic that, well, I got this bit right, so you can't give me no assurance. So I think the message for us surely is if it gets into that column, it's ultra serious as opposed to the one above when it's just serious. Are we happy with that? Okay. Are there any other, I've got a couple of questions, but are there any other members?
Yeah, another one. On page 25 of the follow-up, it says that 2 of the actions had been superseded due to changes in working arrangements. And I appreciate Dan may not have that information with him now, but I'd be keen to find out what those changes were.
Yeah, actually, I've got the full report in front of me, Councillor. One related to the fact that the combined authority sourced its treasury function, and as such, the original recommendation that was agreed was around meeting minutes between the combined authority and Peterborough City Council and the respective treasury functions. So it was superseded by the fact that you'd insourced the treasury management function into the combined authority. And the other one was in relation to the preparation of a progress report and presentation of that to the Audit and Governance Committee. And again, that action was deemed superseded with the revised action that the business plan and medium-term financial plan now comes through to this committee. So there's a little bit more detail for you there, Councillor.
One final question, if I may. So I had 3, Chair. In your report, Dan, you said there aren't any significant implications, which is always good to know. Are there any insignificant implications that we ought to know about?
So I didn't quite catch what sort of implications?
So in the report, Dan said there weren't any significant implications that should be brought to our attention. Just wanted to know if there's anything insignificant which may become significant, which we should know about.
Okay, did you catch that?
Yes, I think that's a fair challenge. I mean, just to clarify my point, so that's obviously in relation to all of the final reports we've got on the agenda today. What I would say is that it's those actions that are probably graded as the medium priority actions within. So we've obviously got 2 of those on the appointments to boards and committees, 3 of those on accounts payable, 1 on the follow-up, and 2 on the capital grants. So we've obviously graded those as medium. The process is that within each of those final reports, we will have agreed an action plan with officers that will have an officer responsible and an implementation date to take those issues forward. I think clearly, if when we revisit those areas, and we will revisit them through a follow-up audit, when we revisit them, they haven't been implemented, we make a determination at that stage whether those actions become, need to become a high priority, and we would report that back through to the committee. So I think that would be my advice on there. It's the medium priority actions, of which there were some in the reports that we finalised on the agenda today, that we will revisit in terms of our follow-up coverage, and we would report back through to the committee later on in the financial year.
Anybody else? Thank you. I've got a couple, Dan. If we look at the progress against the internal audit plan, I wondered if you could just give us some insights on the risk management. I know there's been some dialogue about timing and embedding the recommendations, and also on the IT controls assessment, which has slipped to September, but I know there've been some pressing IT issues. Could you just bring those alive for us?
Yes, absolutely, Chair. So the risk management report, what's actually overtaken that area is we've been having discussions with Rob about actually providing some further support, potentially including the provision of risk management training. And that was specifically one of the issues that was identified within that review. So the reason why we were initially, I think I reported to the last committee, we were initially thinking that in April time we would do a follow-up of some of those actions. That has somewhat been overtaken by the fact that Rob's approached us with a view to RSM facilitating some training in this area to roll out to a number of the officers. So what I would again suggest on that review is that as part of our coverage in 21-22, we would come back to you later on in the financial year to provide some reassurance around the risk management actions. In terms of the IT controls assessment review, and actually, to be fair, that there might be it's an error on my part. I think we've suggested it's now going to be September. I'm fully envisaging that we're hoping, I think you've got another meeting in July, so we're hoping to bring both of those draft reports shown on page 27, hoping to bring both of those to your July meeting. But the IT controls assessment report, that sits at draft. I think that has been delayed in terms of some of the responses, again, that Rob as the sponsor wanted to bring to us, because some consultants have been employed to look into that area by the combined authority, and I think that work is ongoing. And my understanding from Rob, and obviously he can correct me if I'm wrong, was that he wanted to use the outcome of the consultants' work to further inform the action plan within our report. So at this stage, it's sitting at draft, awaiting that information from the consultants to further inform the direction of travel and the sort of timeline of some of the actions that we need to agree within that report. But I'm happy
Thank you, Dan. I think Ron,
if I've
Thanks, Dan. So just to assist the committee, just on both separate points, so Dan's quite right that RSM are going to assist us with training, but actually on the risk register work, but actually we wanted, and it came back from the CMT, the corporate management team meeting, there was a desire to look again at the way that we implement risk management in the authority. So not only are we going to be asking for some training, but we wanted to work with RSM on a consulting level to actually look at how, what our strategy looks like and what our processes are in place. And the reason I wanted to delay the report coming back is that I thought it was important to get our approach right before that we check on how we're delivering against that approach and how we train against it. Seemed to me to be the wrong way around to check our performance when we weren't clear on the best approach to risk management as approved by this committee and hadn't trained it. So we wanted to get that right in sequence, and we've been working with Dan's team to set that up. Separately on the IT report, the report in draft has been a useful document to look at our IT provision. We have been working with an external consultancy called Soccertim. They're a specialist IT provider in the local government sector. And they've come in to look at our needs for the future. But there's also been a decision, and I'm going to update the meeting later at the risk register item. But actually, we've decided to have an intervention on an interim basis, so that we're bringing Soccertim in over the course of the next, we've been working with them over the last month and a half on this, but actually starting now, we're bringing them on board. They're working with our current provider to hand over to them to take forward our IT provision. And again, it seems to be right, yes, we looked at the draft report, but also that in terms of timing, RSM were able to look at what an intervention was delivering for us, rather than, as it were, just before the intervention. We wanted to check and make sure that that direction was effective from an audit perspective.
Okay, thank you. Any other points? Well, thank you very much, Dan, for that update and fielding all our questions. We look forward to your next report in July with your opinion.
Thank you, Chair. I believe I mentioned this in the pre-meet, but if it's okay, I've got to leave this meeting now to jump on another audit committee, if that's okay with everyone.
Okay. Yes, thanks, Dan.
Thanks very much.
See you next month.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Formally, we've noted that report. That was our mission. Thank you. Now we move on, John Alsop, to the draft statement of accounts and the annual governance statement. And here we are to note and review the accounts and note the draft annual governance statement. John.
Thank you very much, Chair. So this report asking the committee, first of all, to note the draft financial statements that were published on the website on the 17th of June. Secondly, to invite the committee to review those draft accounts and to ask any questions that you may have relating to the accounts, and to raise any comments or recommendations that we can feed into the final version that we will be bringing back to the committee for approval on the 30th of July. As you say, we are also asking the committee to note the draft annual governance statements. We're not proposing to go through the accounts in any great detail, but we would draw your attention to some main areas. So along with the financial statements, we have the narrative report, which provides contextual information about the combined authority. It sets out the combined authority's objectives and its strategies, and provides a commentary on how the authority uses its resources to deliver on its objectives, and how it is equipped to deal with future challenges. The narrative report this year is required to include a section on the authority's response to COVID, in particular in relation to the administration of government grants. As you, from the previous report, that's obviously been something that's been looked at by RSM. It's also linked as a risk area within EY's audit plan, and it's also a section which has been included in the annual governance statement, which was a requirement to show how COVID has impacted on the combined authorities' governance arrangements. Also required in the narrative statement and risks identified by EY in their audit plan was to do with the going concern disclosure, which obviously is a very significant part of all external audits for local authorities this year. Relating to that, at year end, the reserves note indicates that we have total balances of reserve balances of £152 million, of which in terms of the equivalent to the general fund, the revenue reserve position is 7.8 million. And the narrative report confirms that the combined authority has an approved balanced budget for the new financial year and an affordable medium-term financial plan over the next 4-year period to 24-25. So we are confident that the going concern basis is appropriate in this case. The narrative report and the financial statements show group accounts for the first time this year, and the description of the subsidiaries and how they've been treated in the accounts is shown at note 1 to the accounts. In terms of timing of the audit and the finalising of the accounts, as mentioned previously, the draft accounts were published last week on the Combined Authorities website with notice of exercise of public rights, which kicked off a 30 working day period in which members of the public can inspect the accounts, ask any questions of us and of the auditor, and to make any objections to them. And in accordance with the audit plan, which was approved by this committee in February, the auditors have already started their audit work, and they are currently expecting to be able to substantially complete this by the July committee. And we are hopeful that we will get agreed accounts for that committee for final review, so that the auditors can complete their work by the end of July, and so to be compliant with the reporting timeline, which is for final accounts to be audited by the end of September this year. Should have Rob Emery, I think, joining us, but myself and Rob will be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, John. Members, questions? Sharon?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for that. Generally speaking, as you'll appreciate, most members of the public don't fully understand how accounts work. They struggle to interpret them, therefore they don't engage in the process. So is there anything that can be done to help them interpret and understand the accounts better by simplifying them?
Thank you. Yes, and that was a point that was raised in the recent Redmond review, and I think going forward there will be guidance on how we can make them, the financial statements, much more accessible to the public. So yes, we'll be waiting for those recommendations and we'll be implementing them as they come forward. But yes, I think it's a well-made point.
Thank you.
Tony?
There's a couple of points on some of the notes of the accounts. On the exit packages on page 36, it says that the 2019-20 was restated. In other parts of the document where there is a restatement, there is a note just to outline what the restatement is. On this one, there isn't. If there can be a note as to the value of the occurrence of the restatement. And on the page further down for the grants provided to related parties, I can appreciate that we are dealing with people on the business board, and on the business board will get grants from the combined authority. I just feel that the disclosure level is not sufficient. It doesn't give a context as to what the grant was for, whether it was a COVID grant, a training grant, a capital grant. It just says they got a grant. So I'd like some additional disclosure around the level of grants provided to related parties and what they were for, in a context of not giving away anything that is confidential, just to provide readers of the accounts with an appropriate disclosure level.
Okay, thank you. Obviously, we'll look at the guidance and see what we can put in to make those 2 points clearer. So thank you for that.
I've got David Brown and then.
Thank you, Chair. It relates to the narrative report, and as an example on page 47, the narrative report talks about Greater Cambridge, but it doesn't define what it means by Greater Cambridge. Now, if it's using the same definition as the GCP, Greater Cambridge Partnership, it's only talking about City and South Cambs and forgets about Hunts, East Cambs, Fenland, Peterborough. So can we either not use the words Greater Cambridge, or if you are talking about the GCP area, say that that's what you're talking about.
Thank you.
And one final point on the annual government statement on page 85, there's just a return missing 2 lines up from the bottom of that page. Just for presentation wise. Thanks.
Yeah.
And 2 questions on page 55. I may have missed it somewhere else, but is there an explanation about why governance costs have increased quite significantly, and similarly the mayor's office costs have gone up quite a lot?
So in terms of the mayor's costs, that includes staffing costs for the mayor. And I think during the course of the year since last year, there has been more posts within the mayor's office. The reason why that cost has gone up. Sorry, in terms of governance costs, I think, sorry,
Well,
those levels
they've
are
gone
fairly
up from
similar.
17 to 49,000, which is relatively small in the greater scheme of things, but as a percentage increase, it's quite significant. And just picking up on what you said about the mayor's office, are staffing costs not picked up then within the combined authority staffing costs? These are...
Yeah. All of the rest of the combined authority staffing costs are in that top line. In the mayor's office is separately budgeted for, it goes to a separate budget setting process.
Right.
And those costs, so it's his immediate advisors that would be included within that line.
So political advisors,
that's right, yes.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
But yeah, certainly I'll look into, I haven't got the detailed notes for the governance costs, but we can provide
Thank you.
information about what that.
Any other?
No?
Sorry, yes, Mike.
On page 51, John, you've got group accounts and CPCA, and I didn't really understand the difference between the two. I mean, for me, group accounts would include trading companies and the like, so if you give me a bit more information on that. On page 56, this is just a comment, I suppose. There's only one line for one CAM, for instance, and it will be interesting as we investigate in future trading companies what we think we might need in terms of more detail on the operating companies. I mean, certainly if CAM were to proceed and it was spending 4 billion, then just one line probably wouldn't mean that we're doing our job, if you like. There seems to be a high level of revenue from capital on page 96, and I'm not quite sure how that works out. Do we have an allocation of capital that we just happen to spend it as revenue, and is there any restriction on that? That's it. Thanks, John.
Thank you for that. Sorry, I didn't catch all of those. But, in terms of the level of detail on the subsidiary accounts, yes, all of the trading companies will be included within the group accounts. There is a level of detail, I think, draw your attention to what the activities of those companies are and how they have been included within the accounting policy and the basis in which they have been included within the group accounts. Obviously, each of those will have their own set of accounts as their own entity. I'm sure we can bring those to the future meeting of the Audit and Governance Committee when they are prepared to give you visibility of that in future. In terms of revenue, so on the, I think you were talking about the higher levels of revenue. These, I think the table that you're referring to includes all revenue costs. It's not just the revenue funds that we receive in year. So it includes all of the capital and revenue funding. Obviously, the level of activity this year has gone up significantly from last year. In terms of the comprehensive income and expenditure statement, that shows that there's effectively, it's doubled in terms of the volume and the value of the transactions that have gone through there. So, and a lot of the funds that we have used during the course of the year are paid to us in advance. So a number of the, for example, the housing and Transforming Cities Fund, this year as well, in the last financial year, we received an additional £80 million of Energy Hub funds, the Green Homes funding. So all of that is included within those tables, and the accounts reflect drawdown of income that we received in year, and also from balances in order to support the expenditure that we incurred during the course of the year. There was another question. Sorry.
Sorry, just on that.
Sorry,
one,
Councillor.
John, I didn't understand.
That might be Rob actually joining us from the, I can't see. Yeah.
Good morning, committee. Sorry, I believe the question was around capital and revenue spend and how we're spending revenue on capital. Is that correct?
Well, the line I'm looking at is revenue expenditure funded from capital under statute. So I didn't understand that terminology, and that's what I wanted to find out about.
So normally local authorities have to spend capital money on capital projects and revenue on revenue projects. Because we're a commissioning organisation, we spend most of our capital funding on other people's assets. So for example, if we do a road project, those roads are actually owned by the County Council or Peterborough City Council. Under standard accounting policies for companies and other private organisations, that wouldn't be considered capital spend because we don't own the asset. Thus, there's regulations within the law to allow local authorities to spend capital funding on those items, even though they don't own them. So that 110 million that you can see there is us spending capital grants on capital projects that are delivered by another organisation.
Okay, so that really comes back to Shaz's point earlier on in terms of members of the public trying to understand these things. It certainly would be useful if we had some commentary at those sort of lines, really, I think, because it does look exceptional to be spending so much money converting it, if you like. Okay, thanks, John.
Just on this, the point that's been made twice now regarding this simplification for the public on their interpretation of the accounts. Could we put on the action list for, say, 6 months' time to see where we got to in the light of the guidance of the Redmond report? Thank you. Are there any? Okay, I've got a, we're doing this as the whole thing, the accounts and the governance statement. Okay. I see in the narrative of the accounts, it lists or identifies the 6 companies which the combined authority has 6 subsidiary companies. But I didn't see anything in the governance statement, and I might have missed it, regarding how this governance of these companies takes place. Now, I know this is, in some extent, this is work in progress, but I do think the governance statement needs to address that, either what is being done or how it would be done. And my other one is slightly tongue-in-cheek. On page 50, it reiterates the point about doubling DVA in 25 years, and that's going back to 2017. But there's no indication of progress. And I think it would be helpful to us and the public to get some idea as to what are the people who follow us on can expect. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. So we will see these again in
the end of July. That's right. Okay.
And if you could, when we next see it, if it could be shown any changes are marked up so that we can see the starting position, that would be helpful. Sorry, Mike.
Yeah, sorry. Are you also doing the annual governance statement at them?
Well, that's what I just confirmed. That we were
right, okay. Well,
so do you have some comments on it?
I have actually, yeah, thanks. I mean, page 110, it talks about the combined authority being strategic in nature. And obviously moving forward, there are things like public transport, all those sort of things. They're sort of operational. So I think going forward, we'll need to start reflecting that. On page 112, it talks about the executive committee, and this is, or the executive committees. They've been in place for nearly 2 years now, and when we get to the work programme, John, I think we really ought to be having a look at how they operate. Just a note from me there. On page 118, you've got the new monitoring and evaluation framework for project delivery. I don't know if we've got an update coming forward on that, because it's not been going for that long. Page 120, adherence to the SIPFA financial management code, which we should be doing from now. I see it coming across as a work in progress, but I assume that when we look at the accounts next year, that will have been fully used, if you like, for that. And there's also a reference on page 122 to the monitoring of projects, but it doesn't give any details. So I think there's a number of things there which we can either comment on today, or we do need an update perhaps in the July meeting as to what stages they're at.
Okay, thank you for that. And yes, we'll include I think some of those will be looked at as points for the formal plan.
Okay. Can I just check I understand what you were hoping for on the project delivery? We have a piece of work later in our year, which is to take a deep dive into how a project is managed and its progress, because there have been concerns expressed previously that there's a trade-off between speed of advance and due process. And one of the reasons we asked for this insight into a deep dive was to get a better understanding of that. But were you implying that you'd like to see a progress chart for all projects?
No, what I'm saying, John, is in the annual governance statement, it mentions quite a few things which seem to be in progress, if you like, and certainly for next year's annual governance statement, I'd expect them to be things which are fully operational. And I want some reassurance that they are making good progress, and certainly obviously in terms of the SIPFA financial management code, that should be fully operational for this year. So, whether we need a review of all of those is open to debate, but all I'm saying at the moment is it would be useful to have an update at the next meeting on those, just so we are reassured, and then if need be, we can drill down a bit more.
So in terms of the code, obviously that is updated on a regular basis. And we get directives and guidance from SIPFA, say for the next set of financial statements, or after that, you will need to include whatever it happens to be within those statements. So they're always changing, and we will follow the guidance and the recommendations to ensure that everything that is in our accounts, should be in our accounts, is in our annual accounts. And that's one of the things that EY, as the external auditors, will look for.
So is this a matter of wording? Do you think that the wording is a little,
It could be,
it could be more exact on progress and outcomes, so that it doesn't look as if it's a generalised statement. Is that?
Well, as an example, John, it says a formal timeline for the creation of the annual governance statement will be established. So, you know, that's obviously a requirement which we're not adhering to at the moment by the sound of it. So, you know, we need to make sure that these things are happening and not just action right at the end, if you like.
We'll review the statement, and then we'll try and make those points much clearer in the final version.
Okay, which we'll see again in July.
In July, that's right. Yeah.
And I thought the point you brought up, Michael, which was also on my list, was about the operational nature of what has now changed in transportation and bus passes and that sort of thing. I didn't actually see it as this is a fast evolving animal, the combined authority, and I'm not sure one gets the sense of this pace of change in the wording. So I think I was going to ask Kim at her update, but I mean, we've taken on what in regard to the operational side of transport? There's a lot of people, a lot of budgets. So I'm a bit unclear. If we could convey some of that change into these words, I think that would remind us, because I think it is important. This organisation's only been going 4 years. And if you think of the number of changes that have had to be absorbed and the challenges that faces for internal control and good governance, a flavour of that might help the reader.
Yeah, I mean, the wording is strategic and commissioning the combined authority. Well, that's changing away from that to an extent, and I think we just need to reflect that really, and that will have an impact on the work of this committee, for instance.
Okay, well, I think that was very helpful, and when you bring it to us next time, as I say, if you could mark in the version the areas in which have been updated or and reflected on some of the points in this discussion, that would ease our discussion next time.
Thank you very much.
Are there any more comments on this item? Okay, thank you. So we now turn to item 8, which is the Treasury Management Outturn Report, which will be presented by Rob Emery.
Good morning, Chair.
We can't see your face. We can see you now, but normally we can't see you. So right, Rob, you have the floor.
I'm not sure seeing me at the moment's a good thing. I'm moving house tomorrow, so apologies for the slightly ragtag background. Before I dive into the paper, since the previous committee meeting at which you recommended the Treasury Management strategies to the board, the CA board have since considered and approved the 21-22 strategies. But there were a few comments both from members of the board and from the Overview and Scrutiny Committee, so I thought I'd report those back so the committee had heard them firsthand. The first was a query from the Overview and Scrutiny Chair, which is the Climate Committee report has suggested numerous actions, including more detail on the climate impact of our investment decisions and projects and how we can mitigate any impacts. There is a piece of work going on as proposed by the CA board to develop a detailed action plan, which will include finding out how much it will cost to do these things. That work is still ongoing, so we're still not in a position to give an exact figure on that yet. The second was that Councillor Herbert asked 2 questions regarding the Treasury management performance. A response has been sent out to Councillor Herbert individually, but for the committee's note, one was a query around, have we made any loss-making Treasury management investments in 2021? The answer to that is yes, we've made one. We received a large capital grant without any notice from government, and thus had to invest it just over the weekend in a loss-making deal, which cost us £20, although that should be viewed against the overall income for the year of 794,000, so hopefully is acceptable. His second question was around the interest rates achieved on housing loans, and we sent him a schedule of those housing loans, and if the committee are interested, that can be provided to them as well. Are there any questions on that before I go into the report?
No, carry on.
Excellent. As the returning members to our committee will know, the Audit and Governance Committee monitor and review the Combined Authority's performance on its capital and treasury management strategies as part of their terms of reference. In terms of the officer input to the committee to enable them to do that, we bring you two reports throughout the year, a mid-year review and an end-of-year report. This is the end-of-year report for 2021, and so talks about where we were on the 31st of March 2021. In reviewing this year's performance, your attention should definitely be drawn to the two indicators discussed at paragraph 2.5, where we haven't kept within the limits that were set in the original Treasury Management Strategy. The first of those, which is principal sums invested for longer than a year. So that looks at all our Treasury Management investments. What's the level of them at the end of each financial year, the current one and the two subsequent ones? We exceeded that expected level for the end of the financial year. So on the 31st of March 2021, we had more money invested in Treasury Management investments than we were expecting. And that's due to us receiving a nearly £80 million grant in 2021 that we were only awarded throughout the year and thus had not forecast to be holding that money at the end of the year. That is due to be spent within 21-22, and as such, that prudential indicator is not breached for the levels at the end of this financial year, nor the end of the one after it. The second indicator that we went over is the interest rate risk exposure. So this is a measure of how much money the authority could lose if interest rates rose or fell by 1% overnight. So in a very unlikely circumstance, admittedly, what sort of level of risk are we looking at? So it's heavily dependent on how much money the Combined Authority has readily available, rather than in fixed term 3, 6, 9 or longer month loans. Again, this has been distorted by that £80 million grant, because that has to be spent within the next financial year, or rather the current financial year now. We couldn't put that out in long-term deals, so it had to be held in fairly short-term liquid investments. As such, we had a greater risk of interest rates changing and have breached that. This was mentioned when we brought the proposed Treasury Management strategy for 21-22 to the committee, and the level in there has been increased from 1 million to 1.5 million in light of that, and we were well within that revised limit. That's sort of the very dry outturn part of this report. Hopefully the second part is slightly more of interest because it's to do with our ongoing treasury management activity and how we've performed in year, and everyone likes hearing about the fact that we earned money. Since the mid-year report that we brought to you in November last year, I believe.
Sorry, I've just got to pause for a moment. Nature calls for the chair. Could I just hand over to the vice chair whilst I'm out of the room? Carry on. Okay, Rob, do you want to carry on?
Absolutely. So the second half of the report covers our actual performance in terms of money and risk. And we reported to the committee in the mid-year report last year that due to the COVID pandemic, interest rates had plummeted and that we were at a significant risk of rates going negative. So we'd end up paying money to loan out our funds. Since then, rates have, while not significantly risen, the forward-looking forecast has improved, and the risk of negative rates and losing money on our investments is almost disappeared. As you might expect, our forecast that we reported to you earlier in the year, it was worse than it turned out to be, and our year-end position, we made £794,000 in interest from our loans. That is still over £200,000 less than we expected to when we set the budget pre-pandemic in January 2020, but is substantially better than we feared it might be halfway through the year. The other thing I'd bring the committee's attention to in the table that's next in the report is there's been quite a big change in the cash held in immediate access accounts. In March 2020, it was 11 million, and this has gone up to 43 million at the end of March 2021. This is because the short-term cash needs of the authority, again, if impacted by that £79 million grant, has significantly increased, and thus we need to have more of those funds readily available. It is also impacted by the difference in how much you get in interest from those liquid funds versus longer-term loans. And those longer-term loans have dropped from around 0.8 to 0.9% to 0.3, 0.4. And so it's just less expensive in terms of opportunity cost to keep those funds in more liquid accounts. Finally, looking at the two graphs that are in the report, these are benchmarking data against other local authorities across the country. The first one shows that despite not doing as well as we'd forecast to at the beginning of the year, compared to the rest of the sector, we're actually still performing above average in terms of the rate of return, while maintaining a portfolio that's about average in terms of overall credit risk. This can be explained, if you look at the second graph, by the average length of the loans we have out are longer than the average local authority. And in general, the longer you can lend your money out for, the better your return, particularly during things like COVID, which are expected to have a lower impact in future years than they do in the current one. There's no decision for the committee. This is a report for them to note and review, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Tony and then Chaz.
Hi there. On the table 1, the Treasury Management Summary for March 21, you've got some deposits for longer than 12 months. What's the reasoning behind the deposits longer than 12 months?
So, as I mentioned, the longer you can put your money out for, the better the rate of return. And as you can see, those longer than 12 month investments are returning 0.6% as opposed to all the others, which the highest is 0.33. So where we have a cash flow that's secure enough that we know we won't need that £10 million for the next 2 years or 1 year, it's better in terms of return to be able to put it out for longer. So it's really showing that our treasury management forecasts have been refined throughout the year and improved to the level where we have certainty that that money won't be needed within that time period, and thus we can access those higher rates.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the question's more around my thinking or thought process was that the CPCA receives funds from government to then spend the funds. We seem to have funds now on deposit for a longer term period. That's the crux of the question. What's happening that we're not focusing on short-term liquidity to enable us to have the funds available in the next 3, 6, 9 months to fund the investments and the growth that we want to do within the environment, but we're now putting it on long term because we don't think we're going to spend it for 2 years.
So the combined authority
retain the funds if we're not going to spend it for 2 years.
The combined authority receives some funds that meet its annual running costs, like its revenue gain share of 8 million, and the majority of that is spent within year. There are other funds such as Transforming Cities Fund and up till this year local growth funding, which we receive on a profile over the course of 4 or 5 years. They're to fund long-term capital investments, which can take quite a long time to start and ramp up. So it's not uncommon for us to receive funding in 1 year that isn't then going to be used to deliver a project until, or not forecast to deliver project spend until year 2 or 3.
Chaz?
Thank you, Chair. Page number 126, 2.5. We've had non-compliance in 2 different areas. Just wanted to know what controls and processes have been put in place to avoid a repeat of those non-compliance areas.
Thanks for the question. In terms of the first one, the principal sums invested, the breaching of that doesn't actually, to my mind, reflect an increased risk to the authority. When we set that limit, or when the committee and the board ultimately set that limit in March 2020, that limit that was breached was our forecast cash held at the end of the year. The only reason we breached that is because we received funding in year that we didn't know about at the start of the year. Government awarded it within the year. There's no additional risk to that per se. It simply reflects an unknown income that was not anticipated. So there's no plan in place to adjust for that other than the programme to spend the grant that we've subsequently been awarded. In terms of the interest rate risk exposure, it's a similar story because the planned expenditure of the combined authority in the forthcoming year is higher than it was anticipated to be when that indicator was set. We therefore need, even if we kept the same proportion of our funding in immediate access accounts, the absolute amount of that proportion would be higher, and thus the impact of a 1% change would be increased in line with that. So the breaching of that interest rate risk exposure is not unexpected. We reported on it in our mid-year report to the board, in our report to the board in January, where we were proposing the 21-22 levels. And so, in effect, what we've done to deal with that is increase the level of the prudential indicator, because as it stood at £1 million, we would always be breaching it in normal operation, which makes it meaningless.
Another question, if I may, Chair. On page 133 on the capital strategy in indicators, we've got 27.77 million for slippage requested. What's the underlying reason for that?
So slippage, just in case any of the committee are unaware, is the term we use for when a capital programme has not spent its budget in the year it was originally planning to do so. So it's when you need to reallocate budget from the current financial year into the next. The reasoning for capital slippage will vary project by project. I can provide a breakdown to the committee. It would have been available as part of the outturn budgetary control report that's going to the Combined Authority Board next Wednesday, but I can provide a summary if it's required.
That'll be useful. Thank you.
Out of committee?
I would do it by email if that's acceptable.
Yeah, that'll be fine. Thank you very much indeed. Are there any other? No more questions. Thank you for that review, colleagues. And thank you, Rob, for introducing the report and answering us so explicitly. Thank you. Thanks very much. We're about 20 past 11. We're about 2/3 of the way through. I estimate another hour or so. Would people like to take a break now, or would like to plough on? We're happy to continue. Okay, good. So the next item 9, is the adult education budget update, where we're asked to note, and I think Janet Warren is due to introduce. Good morning, Janet.
Hello, good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good morning, everyone. It's lovely to see you and thank you for having me. I'm Janet. I'm the lead commissioner working in the adult education budget team, and I'd like to talk you through my paper. Firstly, I'd like to update you on our Year 1 audit funding results. These are the 3 audits being paid for by the Education and Skills Funding Agency. West Suffolk College came back with a satisfactory conclusion of use of funds. They had a 0% error rate on the sample being tested, and I can advise that Cambridgeshire County Council has come back as satisfactory too, with an error rate of 2%, which is below the 5% error rate tolerance. We've recovered the funding identified as being owed. TCHC have at last provided the additional evidence requested by the auditor, which will enable the final report to be produced. However, the outcome is unsatisfactory use of funds and a 20% error rate, which I'm told statistically is the same as being 4 times over the drink drive limit. I still have concerns with this organisation, so we are asking for additional checks to be carried out. For our Year 2 audit arrangements, which is this academic year, I'm currently working with our appointed external audit firm to prepare our working papers. We are developing an interim assurance approach based on the ESFAs, but tailored for our own requirements. For example, we intend to look at subcontracting and learner support claims where the ESFA do not, and will also include the national skills funding that has been delegated to the combined authorities. The planned audits for this year will take place in late July, and these will happen remotely due to the ongoing COVID situation. The 4 identified providers will be notified shortly, and any funding errors identified will be corrected in year. Mazars cannot do any audits that are conflicted. For example, if they act as an internal auditor for any of our providers, and so in future years, it will make more sense for us to work with additional auditors to ensure maximum coverage over our provider base. For Year 3 and beyond, we will be working with our in-house procurement team for a longer-term solution to providing audit and assurance over the use of devolved AEB funds, quite possibly a framework arrangement with 2 or 3 of the firms. Thank you for listening. I'm happy to try and answer any questions.
Very much, Janet. Right. Well, first.
Well, I guess the obvious thing is I'm asking for more information about the TCHC group, which I must admit I've not heard of before I read these papers, and why the provider is being difficult and not cooperating with us or with the auditors.
Very, very good question, Councillor. I can advise you that the audit firm have really not come across a provider like this in their experience. TCHC have been very difficult. They've really drawn out the process, but we are still unsatisfied. We are still looking at different checks we can do on the data. So for me to give you a reason of why they are being difficult, my personal view is that perhaps they are trying to hide something. They obviously have a very high error rate at 20%, and we are still looking into that.
Just obviously, I think Janice made the point there about the fact the auditors are still engaging with them, and obviously what we'd want to do is wait for the outcome of that before we drew any firm conclusions as to concerns with that enterprise. Just worth clarifying that for the committee.
I'm assuming that's something that will come back to this committee as soon as Mazars have reported.
Well, in the next report, yes.
Yes.
Because we receive regular reports on this budget because of the nature of the provision of funds. I think Shaz was next, then Tony.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Wilson's partly covered the question I was about to ask, but I'm interested to find out, what does the 20% error rate actually relate to?
Yeah, so the 20% error rate is in relation to the sample of testing. For example, providers are usually tested on a sample rate of 30 items of funding data. It is then checked for evidence of spend, evidence that learners exist, and therefore the funding has been claimed appropriately. 20% of that funding has come back as incorrect, so it's been incorrectly claimed. So anything over 5% is deemed as unsatisfactory.
So this is the funding year one, and we'll be doing a funding assurance for year two, which is looking historically. For year three, is TCHC still getting funding? So we're not satisfied on year one. We're going to start an audit on year two, but TCHC, being unsatisfactory, are still getting funding in year three. Is my thought process right?
No, I can confirm that TCHC, we ceased contracting with them in the first year. They didn't make it to the end of the first year. We were not happy with their performance at all. So we no longer contract with them.
Okay, that's fine. That's the question.
Did you have a question, Mike?
That's answered it.
Okay.
Are we dropping?
Any other? Under the significant implications, Janet, you talk about there's a limited number of funds, and if we decide we require full assurance on all 15 providers each year, which I don't think you're doing at the moment. I just wonder, when you look at the figures, how you're approaching that decision on the need for that, and what the level of, the materiality of the amounts of money we're talking about. How do you balance that?
Very good question, Chair. In terms of materiality, the biggest providers are being audited first, and we're looking at it as on a risk-based approach. So in terms of the other controls that we implement as well, that's all taken into consideration. Of course, it is an option that if we wanted to, we could audit all providers on a yearly basis. What we're doing is we're taking the year one results to give us a sector-wide error rate. So unfortunately, TCHC is bringing the error rate really bad. One of the colleges had 0% errors, and the other provider had 2%. So in the main, it's coming back as satisfactory at the moment. Anybody else that we felt was at high risk, we would certainly wish to audit them as well. I can look into this as an additional item for next time, if you like.
No, I think you've answered. The fact you're taking a risk-based approach was really the answer I was looking for, so that's fine. So when will you provide us the next update, or when are you due to provide us the next update?
I'm not sure, Chair, when I'm next due back, but when would you like me to come back?
I'm just waiting for advice. Do we need it? So it's, I think the choice is 6 months or a year. What do members feel? Sooner? 6 months. Okay. So we'd like to receive another update from you in about 6 months' time. Thank you very much, Jenna.
Thank you, Chair and members. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Bye-bye. Right. Item 10 was the Independent Commission on Climate Change, and the committee did ask for an insight as to how this was being taken forward and managed. Remember, it's not about the decisions, but the processes that will be used. We have a report, and will be introduced by Paul Rains.
Good morning, Chair.
Good morning, Paul. Thank you for joining us.
I'm afraid I'm not Paul Rains. I don't claim to be in issues.
Sorry, who are you then, sir?
Apologies, Chair. It's Adrian Cannard. I work for Paul. I'm the Strategic Planning Manager for the Combined Authority, and I support the Independent Commission on Climate Change activity within the Combined Authority.
Apologies for the misinterpretation. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, committee. You have a report in front of you which gives you an update on the process that the Climate Change Commission has gone through in coming up with its first set of recommendations. So as a bit of background, the authority established the Independent Commission, and the Commission has split its work into two phases. The first reported in March, and the next report will likely be in the autumn, in September, October. The Commission looked at a number of themes in the first phase: transport, buildings, energy, and peat issues. And it made a series of recommendations to the Combined Authority and to other organisations where it was relevant. And they did that on the back of research that was undertaken. So the Commission had the University of Cambridge look at climate change risks that faced the Combined Authority area. And it also commissioned the University of Leeds to look at the costs of implementation of some of the measures that might be recommended. It also undertook public engagement, a call for evidence, and established a number of working groups where it brought in specialists in that field to give their views on how the issues affected Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. So we have the set of recommendations from the Commission. They will be going to the Combined Authority Board next week. And as I said, there's an ongoing piece of work to address other topics. And those are adaptation, nature, water, business, and a just transition. So the Commission found in their first phase that the costs of implementation and the impacts of climate change potentially could fall disproportionately on different parts of the Combined Authority area, and wanted to look in more detail at what that meant for residents and businesses across the authority's area. And so that's a key strand that they're picking up in their second phase of work. That's essentially where we are with the Commission. And as I said, there is another piece of work still ongoing.
Thank you. Are there any comments or questions?
Well, I guess, Chair, I'm not absolutely clear what we're being asked to do. I've got a comment on the recommendations that there appears to be a distinct lack of anything about flood risk in the Commission's recommendations, even though it's identified as a specific vulnerability in paragraph 2.4. I could throw that in as a comment, but I don't think that's really what we're after.
No, because that's really the what is. It's about the processes. There were, in the debates that have preceded this about the environment and climate change, members expressed a keen interest in this piece of work. And previously we had a look at the committee and its terms of reference. And this report was called for to give us some assurance about how this is going to be taken forward. And for instance, I know a climate, the Mayor is probably going to, or has been proposed to chair the climate cabinet for this work. I think if we have a further interest is whether we need more, would like more assurance on the way in which this is being governed and progress is being made, given the nature of the recommendations. I'm open-minded to what members would like next.
Question: is there any gauge as to any money that is spent on this has a value? Everything else has a cost ratio to it, and is there anything within this report that will in some way bring to this committee that there is a cost ratio, that this is actually delivering good value for money? Couldn't see anything in there about that. Is that part of the report that will come later on?
Did you hear those comments?
Yes, so I think there's the two aspects to that. So in terms of the impact on the combined authorities operations, depending on the response that the board takes in terms of reaction to that, then there could be cost implications of adopting measures that are delivering on climate adaptation or mitigation. So for example, in the affordable housing programme, there is an option to do more in terms of the climate adaptation of the schemes that we fund, and that would have some cost implications to be assessed. In terms of the work of the Commission itself, there is an annual budget attached to the work of the Commission, and what the terms of reference state is that when they bring forward their second report, they give recommendations on what would be a cost-effective mechanism for monitoring and implementing climate change going forward. And that will be a recommendation back to the Combined Authority to consider how it might want to implement that and set up any governance arrangements.
Put that forward as a recommendation that does come to any reports that we receive back.
Okay.
In terms of cost ratios for what's going to be spent on that.
So the governance arrangements will rely on proposals in the second report to come in September. So do I have any advice as to how we might see this from a governance perspective? Maybe to have a look at it in a year's time when it's settled in, or do we want to get involved in, not involved, but have a closer assurance check on what governance arrangements are in due course? I'm floundering.
Mr. Chairman, I think we do, don't we? Because as a result of this work, some actions will be forthcoming, some internal organisation will be set up. So what we want to do is, from this committee's perspective, I think is see how whatever recommendations are approved are implemented. I don't think, to go back to Councillor Wilson, I agree with him on flooding. I think you're absolutely right, but it's out with our remit to go into that area. But it's such an important area and such one of such interest to all of us. And I think we do wish to keep a perspective on what the Combined Authority is doing in terms of generating recommendations, being implemented.
And would that be sort of the end of the year, in January? I mean,
Chair, if I might, I think the governance and the way that this is going to be dealt with is through that climate cabinet, or actually I think it's called the climate working group. And it may be that you will want to have a look at the terms of reference, because the reason you put this forward for your agenda was that there was a lot of concerns raised about what this authority was doing to deal with emissions and climate change mitigation. And you were concerned that there wasn't a sufficient level of importance being given to that issue within this organisation, and as a result of which, there were discussions which happened internally within the board about how they were going to deal with that. Many councils, as you know, declared a climate change emergency. We didn't, but what we did was brought about this Climate Change Commission to start having a look at and taking a more broad brush approach to how we were going to deal with climate change risk. And so the Climate Working Group is the group that is going to be set up, which will actually look at taking all the recommendations now and in October and bringing them together and developing an action plan. Because you have particular concerns around whether the risk is being met, you may want to look at the terms of reference of that working group when they're available. So that is something you could bring forward, and then you may want to have regular updates, I would suggest, at this committee, which then look at how those recommendations are implemented. I certainly agree that I think there's no harm in putting forward any recommendations you've got about the mitigation of flood risk. We saw, didn't we, over Christmas, how important that was for our area, and particularly around Auchenbury, where we did get a lot of flooding. So I think it's quite legitimate for this committee to raise that as a request to the climate change working group, that you'd actually like to see where that is coming through in the terms of reference and how that is being dealt with. So I would suggest, yes, terms of reference, have a look at that, and then put it on as a regular update on your items to ensure that risk is being met.
Thank you, that's very helpful, Kim.
I mean, yeah, I mean, it's really an extension of what's just been said. From my memory, we were looking at the projects that the combined authority was getting involved in terms of infrastructure and development, and saying, in the projects you're promoting, there doesn't seem to be a real view on the impact of climate change and whether climate change should alter the perception or the direction of those projects. And that's why we put forward wanting climate change to be on the risk register to have it. I mean, I look at the document, and it's very extensive and wide, and I look at some of this isn't combined authority, some of this is local authority, some of this is planning, some of this is outside of the remit of the combined authority. So I think it's a broad brush approach. I think it has to be refocused to deliver climate change attention to the projects that the combined authority is involved in the framework of this committee reviewing the projects and their deliverables to include climate change, because that was how we approached it a year ago, from my memory.
Okay, so we'd like to keep an awareness of the recommendations at the next stage, the terms of reference, the action plan. So that would be the back end of this year, I suppose that would be. So in the end of the year meeting, or the first one in the new year, and we would like officers to report back concerns about the absence of flooding so far appearing in any of the recommendations. Are we happy with that? Good, thank you very much. And thank you for bringing it on. And thank you from off stage. We look forward to an updating of all those things at the end of the year in January. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Chair and Committee.
Okay, goodbye. Not sure I like this process. Right, we're coming to item 11, which is the corporate risk report, which we are going to be asked to note and recommend any changes. And we gave a little taste in the internal audit about some of the things going on in this area. Robert Parkin.
Thank you, Chair. So this is the regular item to bring to you today, the corporate risk register, to note to you any changes and to invite you to make any recommendations for proposed changes, and of course to ask if those members of CMT are available today to answer any questions and respond. So the risk register, our methodology is to rely upon directorates individually to look at what risks may arise in their endeavours, and to bring forward new items onto the risk register, the corporate risk register, through the CMT meeting. And we'll also use that forum to hear from relevant risk owners on changes to risk entries. We've, through our time working with the risk register, have tried to develop different ways of presenting it. The document itself, as you'll no doubt be trying to navigate on devices, is quite large to go around, but we have a heat map and a change list, which hopefully is easy to navigate. The areas I'd like to draw your attention to are listed in the significant implications part of the report, and those are the two change items. The first one was mentioned earlier on in the context of the audit report relating to IT, and in this instance we're looking to, or we've changed residual score on the risk of lack of capacity and resilience in the IT provision to the CPCA. We've moved that down from 8 to 4, and that's because we consider and we have confidence that the likelihood of this risk arising is reduced considerably. The reason for that is that through CMT we commissioned a review of our IT provision, working with the current provider, 3Cs, and have also worked with our consultant to be able to be in a position to intervene, to bring in some immediate support to us, to ensure that we've got a responsive and resilient system capacity on IT. So I'm pleased to say that that work has gone well, and very grateful to 3Cs for working with us to cooperate in that shift. We're moving over to a different provider on an interim basis, pending a future decision about a long-term solution for us. But the interim arrangement, we have confidence in bringing stability and resilience. The next item is a change in the risk entry that was described as the risk being a possible change in political leadership management, and how, in particular, that as an organisation we would respond to that in terms of realigning capacities and reviews. That entry has changed to reflect the fact that there was a change in political leadership, and therefore we describe that as now working with that change and focusing ourselves on what that entails. Chair, happy to take any questions that members of the committee have today, and it may be that John Alsop and Kim could answer as well if I'm not able to.
Yeah, deathly silence. Just the risk you closed down about the change of political leadership. I mean, this is a first experience. The processes, whatever they were, did you have any? Or did you have to deal with this as step by step? And are there any learnings to make it easier in the future?
Happy to lead on that. I would sort of, speaking generally, I think in working in local government, we're primed to respond to changes in direction, because they happen at any particular stage. And I think it's part of it's incumbent on us to be quick and responsive, and to know how to quickly draw resources around changes in direction. So I would hope, as a general sort of steady state for officers and our teams, we're always able to respond to that. And of course, the build-up to an election certainly brings that to the fore of our minds. But it may be that John has something he wants to add, or even Kim on that response.
So I would add, Chair, if I might, that it was only 4 years ago that we introduced the mayors, and so therefore I think having a transition of mayor was, in effect, has been a repeat of what we did earlier. But yes, if there's any learnings we can take away, I think having spoken to, there was only one other combined authority. Well, there are two. One which was recently established, so that was the new West Yorkshire Combined Authority that has its first mayor. The West of England Combined Authority also had a new mayor, and we had a new mayor, and we have been comparing notes about what we did to transition the organisation from where it was to where it needs to be, because we will have essentially a policy rewrite, a priorities rewrite, and then of course we've got a new mayor, a new chair of our combined authority to bring up to speed. So there was a lot of work to do in those very early stages, but we took a lot of learning from other combined authorities. We now operate in a group which is called the M10. Sounds like a motorway, but actually the mayors all meet together regularly for discussion. They're very mutually supportive of each other, and the M10 chief executives also meet together regularly, and we also provide a sort of support network and a practice and learning network for each other. So yes, there was, I think, if we are preparing for the next mayoral term, I think we will have a more sound transition plan in future. But apart from that, I think it has been relatively smooth in terms of the handover.
Thanks very much. Sorry. Excuse boots. You're okay. Right, so there are no other comments. Well, I think that's a plus and a commendation to Robert and his team, because we have wrestled with this, tried to find a way in which we can get the dynamics of how risk management is taking place within the combined authority, and how you distill out of this mass of data that strategic view. So I think I'll take today's reaction as being a plus for the approach going, Robert. And I would only add for the next report, bearing in mind the work you're doing with trying to embed and train on risk management, if your next report could just give us a little insight as to how that's proceeding. Yeah.
Can I add, Chair? I think, and I wanted to thank the committee for all the work they've done to actually get us to this point with the risk register. It has been a long journey, but it's now an embedded process within the organisation where CMT regularly look at the risk register. I don't think the work stops here, though. I mean, as you know, the risk register has to be a very dynamic document, because we have to be constantly looking at it and constantly updating it. But I think more importantly for this committee, I think there is a question for this committee about now whether you start to focus some of your future work programming around what is on the risk register. Because you are getting regular reports like the AEB, the Adult Education Budget reporting here, because that was initially identified as a risk on our risk register. I think there is a question of how long you therefore need to be seeing items that were previously a risk but are no longer, but then items that come up as a risk. How do you want then to deal with those to ensure they are being monitored going forward, and whether you see that as a key part of your role as this committee. So I think there is a discussion to be had about the relevance of the risk register now that we have it in a state where we are all satisfied that it is doing its job. I think what added value from it as a committee going forward.
Thank you, Kim. That's a good food for thought. Any reaction? Tony?
Yeah, this committee, from my perception, is to look at the framework and the governance and to ensure that we are devising and enhancing that framework, and where there are risks or mitigations or errors, omissions, they're brought to our attention so that we can strengthen the framework. With the current risk profile, it's where there's some of that work now on the corporate risk register comes away from the Audit and Corporate Governance Committee and goes on to overview and scrutiny. We don't want to step on their toes. If there are, I mean, I'd expect to see more action around risks being reduced as opposed to risks just staying as they are. Would be my only comment. But that this committee reviews new risks coming on or risks that are being reduced, risks that are staying static, should be an overview and scrutiny. I mean, I'm just trying to think of something off the thought.
I thought we were doing so well.
Sorry.
I'm just trying to puzzle these in my mind, because absolutely the decisions that are made on managing a risk are separate from what is the process for the management of it. And it's interesting with the adult education budget. I asked whether you wanted, the materiality, and I said, do we want to do this in 6 months or 12 months? I mean, we have I think it's a statutory right to look at the adult education budget, as I recommend. It has to come to us. But is it actually strategic? And is it right? Is it right that we keep looking at it or not? Well, these are difficult judgments, aren't they? And I go with the group. But I think what I'd ask Robert to do is to perhaps just have a little assessment of answering the Chief Executive's point about is our table of work, how does it align with the risks of the authority, and should we have a ponder about that or not, as the case may be? Is that maybe you and I could have a meeting before the next time, just to take a view on it, because we mustn't just steadily move forward. It's quite right, we should pause for a bit. So yeah, I think that's a very helpful suggestion.
Yeah, and just to pick up on Councillor Mason's point, we're working with CFGS, the Centre for Governance and Scrutiny, on looking at the review and scrutiny arrangements in combined authority settings, and this one in particular. And there'll be an opportunity in those discussions to understand the sort of the balance of activity on risk, if you like, and that's something that we could pick up on and address back to say, you know, whether there needs to be, as it were, an active reference across to that committee of this risk register.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, Mike.
Yeah, I mean, I think this needs to be proportionate, doesn't it, really? And obviously, if we're talking about trading companies going forward, we'll obviously get our teeth into that for a while, but the numbers might be much bigger at some stages. So I think we've just got to make sure that we are handling this within the overall financial arrangements of the combined authority, and making sure for each of these, not outliers, but these different types of activities, if that we look at them, make sure we know how they operate, what measures are in, and then they become quite mainstream after a while, don't they?
Exactly. Thank you. Item 12, Robert Parkin again, the review of governance policies and the annual report. So there's a comment on the procedures, review of the procedures. Have we got any thoughts on change?
Yep, so thank you, Chair. So this is very specifically the governance policies that relate to whistleblowing complaints procedures, and it also reports back to you on where we are with how many of those complaints we've received, and our, as it were, looking on our performance on freedom of information requests. It's asking you to respond with whether you'd like me to take a deeper dive into those corporate policies, whistleblowing and complaints, or whether you're content, as I am, that they remain current. We've made textual adjustments just to refer to current incumbents in posts. Otherwise, they remain the same, and I'm confident that they are current and appropriate. Taking you through the report itself and the contents, we had no whistleblowing complaints in the course of the year that comply with, as it were, what a whistleblowing complaint is. Corporate complaints, 4 complaints, all were responded to within the statutory timeline. 2 of those related to procurement issues, and those were specifically in relation to disappointed, disgruntled tenderers, and that led to one process being restarted, having examined it to make sure that it was robust. The other one was answered. The other complaint response is referred to the A10 pre-consultation issues and a complaint around the process of grant application. Freedom of information requests, 2 things here. I just want to, following a helpful prompt from Councillor Brown, give you a breakdown of the thematic areas of interest. I also wanted to just address with a little bit more detail this response. The text here refers to there being 6 late responses. Just want to qualify that. The Freedom of Information Act provides that responses must be within 20 working days. However, the period can be extended and is properly extended an extra 20 working days when there is a public interest test to apply. And further, where there is a request which engages, which is complex or involves voluminous documentation as one of them, doesn't include the area of the team that I've been working hard to develop and give capacity to. And in particular, we've been working with colleagues at Cambridge County and Peterborough City, who have a very well-developed freedom of information and data protection team, GDPR team. And so we'll be looking to the future to develop our processes and make them as efficient as possible and look to them for their expertise and advice. On the question that Councillor Brown helpfully prompted, main topics of interest for FOI, 5 related to the transport area, 4 were on procurements, 3 were in relation to the impacts of COVID-19 on the work of the combined authority, 2 were related to grants applications, 2 were on human resources policy questions, and 2 were locality related. And I'm afraid I don't have a more detailed explanation of what locality related means, but I'm happy to supply that. The other 4 were on topics which were very individual, standalone. So that's all I wanted to talk through. As I say, the recommendation is to invite any comments, to ask if members would like me to take a deeper look at the policies, and to note the number of corporate complaints and FOI responses for the period 2020 to May 21.
Thank you, Chairman. Just on the policies, they both look current to me, and I personally don't see the need to spend time doing any further deep dive into them. I understand why, but the whistleblowing policy still uses the Alconbury address, so that just needs to be updated.
Mike.
I'm not going to argue that this is the reason for the low number of complaints, but I went on this morning onto the page and it goes to a 404 page, Robert, so you might want to make sure that's working. But I wanted to move on to a general question, because certainly in local authorities, a lot of the complaints are due to lack of progress on what we might call customer services. We've mentioned a couple of times so far today about the fact we are becoming a bit more operational in terms of buses, for instance. And I wondered what had happened in terms of transfer of support for people applying for bus passes, etc. And from my own perspective, one of the real-time bus displays isn't working in my area. Normally I'd go to the county council, so it's not totally clear if you go onto the web pages at the moment. It says for transport, go to Cambridgeshire County Council or Peterborough, which I assume is wrong for public transport, for instance. So where are we in terms of becoming more operational in terms of our interactions with the public to make sure those don't become complaints, if you like?
So a comment on certainly my team was supporting the team in the Transport Directorate that was transferring in those services, and there was essentially a TUPE transfer of the principal staff and the resources around the service area. So as it were, the undertaking of delivering that services has moved into the combined authority. There's other points that are important things on detail that we would need to get a response on around the real-time display and as you see, the landing point. I don't have the answers here, but I'll certainly relay those through to the team, and no doubt they can give a response.
Tony.
Just to clarify something, so the wording you used was the whistleblowing was that there were no whistleblowing that complied with the requirements to be a whistleblower. So were there any that didn't comply?
Whether something is a whistleblowing complaint really depends upon, it's almost like a freedom of information request. You don't need to say that it's an FOI request for it to be so. A whistleblowing request has a certain quality in the sense that it is seeking to claim that there will be an impact on an individual in terms of their employment relationship if they raise a concern. And we didn't have any of those in nature. You do get other sorts of complaints, but they don't fall into that category. So hopefully that's clear.
No,
okay, trying to unpack
it's
it a
just
bit more.
saying that there have been no occasions of any whistleblowing.
That's probably a better answer I should give in the first instance rather than muddying it.
Or as you said, there have been no complaints that meet the whistleblowing criteria, but there have been 2 that came in that were purporting to whistleblowing but did not fulfill the criteria and were not taken forward. I mean, it's sort of the nuances in the complying bit that I'm going, okay,
yeah,
where there's some that didn't comply, that what was the reasoning, but instead of the reasoning behind it, just it's not understand the framework of the whistleblowing and what can fall within that framework and what falls outside of that framework.
Yeah. Sorry for the slightly unclear. We had an issue earlier this year where it could have been we weren't sure whether it was a whistleblowing complaint. We engaged with the individual. It transpired that it was not a whistleblowing complaint. So that was, I guess, that was I suppose a one that could have been but wasn't, and that was the nearest to it, and there was nothing else. And in terms of the detail, because of the nature of those complaints that relate to individual employment relationships, we don't go into detail in a public setting. But thank you for the question, because I hope I should have given that clarity straight off.
Yeah, it's just on getting that it's none. There was a potential.
Yeah.
And
that's it. Thank you.
Okay. No other comments. Thanks. How often do we need to review these policies, and when do we get further insights into arisings?
So, Chair, it's on an annual basis at the moment. Although I might just check in with our scrutiny officer. I think we have on the work plan a report coming in, don't we, following a request?
We've got our information governance update in
yeah.
September, which will include issues including FOI complaints and forwarding.
So we've got, yes, so hopefully we've got, sorry, which month was that?
September.
September, we're bringing back the metrics on complaints. So complaints, FOI and whistleblowing. We'll just come back with those numbers rather than the annual review of the policy, which is an annual review.
Okay. Thank you. Well, I don't sense we want to deep dive into the policies, and we're grateful for the insights on the arisings or the almost arisings, and look forward to your September paper. Thank you. So that brings us now to Kim Sawyer. Thank you very much for joining us. I know you had a busy morning, and we look forward to your update at this transformation period.
And I do apologise for being late today, so thank you for allowing me to drop this item on the agenda, Chair. I just wanted to say before I start, welcome to the new members of the Audit Committee. It's nice to see some new faces on the Audit Committee. It brings a new perspective, I think, to items that we bring here, but equally it's nice to see some old faces back as well, because continuity is equally important. And so I just wanted to say, that despite the fact that we've had a few decision-making meetings since the Audit Committee last met, and I provide an update, members, between what's going on in the combined authority world between meetings. Despite the fact there's been very few decisions, actually there's been almost seismic change in the combined authority, because the elections brought a new mayor to the combined authority, and effectively a change of politics, but not just here, but across, as you know, you're all aware, across the county also. So that's really changed the dynamic of the combined authority. And as you see, hence the reason why we have some new faces as well on our committee today, and it's impacting all of the committees across the whole of the combined authority. So we are, as a management team, working with the new mayor at the moment and through the lead strategy meetings to look at what the implications of having a new mayor as the chair of the combined authority means for each of for not only the combined authority but for each of the constituent councils. The immediate moves that we are seeing in governance terms are a greater involvement, I think, of greater collaboration between the combined authority and its constituent members. So there is a definite drive for more cooperation, and that forms part of one of the Mayor's 3 Cs, as he calls it, his compassion, cooperation and community, and those are the values that he is using to drive forward the way he wants to work with the Combined Authority Board and the way in which he would like all of us, each of the constituent councils, to also work together. So we're seeing a change in the way that the Combined Authority will operate in future going forward. And we wait to see what the outcome of that means for all of us and the way that we work together. There was also a decision made before the election that they were going to recruit for a new chief executive of the organisation, and that recruitment has now finished. And you may have seen from the board report next week that a new chief exec will be appointed to the Combined Authority, but at present, because they have obligations to their employer, we're not at liberty to disclose their identity, but there is an expectation that that will be made publicly known by next week. And so not only do we have a change at political level, but also there will be changes at officer level also. So a completely a new sweep, I think, at how we are going to do business as an area. Internally, I think there has been some significant changes. So we've talked some part today about the transport changes. So for the first time, we are actually going to be delivering services to the public, as Councillor Sargent has said. We have TUPE transferred in the transport functions from Peterborough and Cambridgeshire into the Combined Authority. The Combined Authority has always held transport functions since it was created in 2017, but until it felt ready to actually deliver those services itself, it sought to rely on Cambridgeshire and Peterborough to deliver those services on its behalf. So we are in the process of bringing those all in now and delivering those services direct to the public. And what that effectively means is that we are going to be doing our passenger transport services will now come under the badge of the Combined Authority. Correct, Councillor Sargent, we don't yet have all of the services internally, and this partly links to the IT review that Robert was talking about, because there are some software issues for delivery of bus passes, and I believe as well around the real-time information. So we are still, there is still a transition going on for some of those services, but generally on the whole, we will now be delivering transport services from within the Combined Authority, which is I think demonstrates partly the maturity of the organisation as we move forward. And on the transport side, you will have seen that one of the mayoral comments made was that the CAM programme was not his way of delivering future transport needs for this area. So the board is at present looking at how and whether they should, what should take place in place of the CAM, and whether they're going to make the decision to move away from that CAM programme. And we're expecting that to come to the board in July. Internally, there's a governance review going on, and Robert will be leading that on behalf of the organisation. You are correct, again, Councillor Sargent, it's about looking at, you know, the committees, are they operating effectively? Are we getting what we need? But with a new drive and a new strategy for how we're going to work together in cooperation, it's whether that governance review is working effectively for everyone. I think one of the key issues is that why are it's taking so long, why the board meetings taking so long, why are the pages so numerous? And that has really prompted a look at a number of related issues, which says actually we need governance review across the whole area, because it's the way we're working and the way we're choosing to make decisions that is actually taking you know, an awful lot of time and effort from members, and there perhaps are more effective ways of doing that. And then key, of course, to what we're doing is going to be climate change. I think that in the Constituent Council, but also in the Combined Authority, climate change is going to play a key factor, and is playing a key factor in the way that we're moving forward. And I would say that, again, I think the fact that we are bringing a climate change report, which looks at the whole area and perhaps beyond the remit of what the Combined Authority itself can do, demonstrates, I think, a maturity of the Combined Authority itself. It's starting to say, let's commission, we've got the opportunity to commission an area-wide report, let's do that, but then let's engage with partners about how we can deliver all of the recommendations that come out and actually speak to everybody about whether all those recommendations are supported, because as you know, and you may be aware, there are particular issues in Finland around the peat recommendations. So that's something that we need to be mindful of. Our continued focus as an authority, both prior to and post the election, is also going to be around economic recovery. And you will see from the board papers next week, there are a significant number of reports that deal with our economic recovery and how we are going to work towards the economic recovery of this area. So looking at the various strategies that we have in place to empower our area to actually be even more economically successful than it has been. During this COVID phase, we've probably suffered less than most other areas of the country, and there are some very good statistics about our GVA and how we have achieved GVA. And so, yes, I totally agree with you, Chair. I think that those sorts of diagrams ought to be going into our annual governance statement to demonstrate not only the impact that we as a combined authority are having, but obviously what we can do to influence economic recovery in the future. So those are the sort of key issues internally. And then, of course, we've got our external focus. You'll all be aware of the Oxcams ARC. And there has been a real drive since the budget of this year, March of this year, by the government to focus on the Oxcam ARC as an area where it wants to, it sees opportunity for economic recovery and growth. And so it has announced in a paper that it produced about how it plans to produce a strategic planning framework for ARC. And it is also looking now at setting up a statutory growth body for the ARC, which will mean that there will be, it will have powers to drive certain growth opportunities across the ARC. And we await to hear from government what that means, but clearly it's going to play a big part for us as a combined authority, but also as a number of constituent councils. And I can see, Councillor Ball, you're nodding because you're aware of the development corporation that's proposed for the edge of your area. So the Oxcams ARC is going to feature quite heavily in our going forward. Then we've got the Lep Reviewers. They have an ongoing Lep review for some time, and that's going to affect our business board and the way in which we operate. You may have seen that funds are no longer coming directly into the business board as they are not with any of the other Leps. Government has decided instead that it's going to centralise all bidding. And so we have been bidding in for the Community Renewal Fund and the Levelling Up Fund in order to take forward some of our key projects. So there is a change in the way that we may, that funds may not be directly devolved to us in the future, or not so many funds devolved to us, but we will be in a competitive bidding process with other combined authorities and other local authorities to ensure that we get sufficient funds for our area to level up. And levelling up is really important to us. As you know, in Fenland, this is particularly key. And I think one of the key facts that we've drawn out recently is that it's far quicker to get from Cambridge to London than it is to get from Cambridge into March, for example. In fact, it takes more than twice as long to get from Cambridge into March. So within our own area, there are real disparities. And also Councillor Sargent will know, within Cambridge itself, actually there are wide levels of variations in economic deprivation. So levelling up is also going to be one of those areas that we will be looking to government to see what opportunities there are for us to level up within our own area. And a levelling up white paper is expected also this year. It started as a devolution white paper last year, but it's expected now to be a levelling up paper this year. And we're not expecting that, I think, until late summer or early autumn. But that's also bound up with what happens with the LEP and the future of that. And I think then finally, the only other key issue that we've had is the skills white paper has come out, and that has demonstrated an impact on the combined authority, because we have been keen through the skills committee, but also the various systems that we've put in place and the panels, that we link skills to employer needs in this area. So we've got the business board and we've given them responsibility for skills to link those, you know, what employers need with where are the skills and where they're going to find the people, the employees they need of the future. But the skills white paper has come out to where will no longer be devolved any future skills powers. Those skills powers are going instead to British Chambers of Commerce, who will be asked to work with employers to look at building skills improvement plans in the future. So we're still considering, I've talked to you about the M10, we're still considering as an M10 what that means for us, because we were very keen to try to make some inroads into apprenticeship training and the apprenticeship levy, so that we could show that we could really make a difference locally in our area. And we have already persuaded some employers to use their apprenticeship levy and circulate it amongst smaller businesses to enable them to bring on apprentices. But at the moment, that looks a bit hampered. So that, in a nutshell, Chair, is what's going on in combined authority world. Although it's been, all the focus has been on the elections, in fact, there is an awful lot going on at government level, policy level, which is likely to have an impact on us going forward in the future. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for that tour de force on a complicated world. And for our new colleagues, right from the beginning, I'm conscious that we're distant from the day-to-day of the combined authority. So this is why we always welcome the Chief Executive to give us a thumbnail of what's going on. And there's an opportunity for brief questions if anybody wants to ask.
Thanks for that, Kim, and I very much note your comment about decision making, the length of board reports and the like. I mean, as you know, I was on the housing committee, and you know, I did find it quite difficult sometimes to fully get to grips with everything that was going on. And as I said earlier, I think it's September 2019, the committees changed, didn't they? And I think it's important, as I said earlier on, that we ought to review how the executive committees work by this, you know, as part of our role in terms of governance, because I think it's an important part of the decision making by the combined authority. I'm very disturbed in some ways that you didn't mention it, Kim, and it wasn't in the minutes from the last meeting, in terms of the issues around the housing, the 100 million housing grant, because, you know, that is obviously a real negative in terms of the combined authority in the eyes of the MHCLG. And the letter exchanges between the combined authority and the minister. And, you know, I think we need to investigate what went wrong. I think it's a good indicator, perhaps, in some ways, of, you know, as part of our review of the way that the executive committees work. But I'm sure there will be other matters as well that will come out of that. So I would like to see that going forward, John, on our work programme, that we do actually look at the lessons to be learnt from what happens with the housing grant. I mean, I was on the housing committee from September 2019, and I raised for a long time my concerns about the delivery, and even in January, the director was assuring us that we would deliver. And, you know, one of the major criticisms from the MHCLG was the lack of delivery. And I think I certainly was quite frustrated with the sort of information we were getting as committee members. So I would very much like, when we discuss the work programme, that we look at that. But perhaps the question to Kim really is there any further update on the situation with MHCLG and the use of funding, and perhaps any more funding potentially that we could get out of MHCLG for housing? I did note in the letter from Luke Hall there was a dangle, if you like, of potentially more funding, but at the moment I think it's just capped at 55 million, if I remember correctly.
Chair, yes. Yes, I hadn't mentioned it because there is quite an extensive there's an extensive report going to the board next week, which I presumed you may have already seen. It's got a number of appendices to it, and what it is it's an attempt to examine where we are at the moment on the current housing programme. So there is a level of detail in there which you can refer to if you want further detail. In brief, I think there are two issues here. One is where are we at present? We are at present at the point where everybody thought, I think, that the affordable housing programme ran to March 2022, and it was quite late in the day that MHCLG raised the issue that it didn't run to 22 but ran to 21. We had from the outset been planning for a March 2022 date, and we were required to deliver 2,000 houses by March 2022. You will see from the papers that we have actually put a pipeline forward of over 2,400 cases to March 2022, and we are now waiting for MHCLG to say whether or not which of those they are going to support. We are in ongoing dialogue with them about which ones they will support, but that dialogue is continuing, so we haven't yet quite concluded the existing affordable housing programme. The other issue was value for money, and we were delivering a value for money of 35,000 per home, and MHCLG have said that our value for money ceiling is 45,000 per home. So we have been, up until the point of concern, unhappy about the value for money. Well, we have met the value for money criteria. I think the issue for me, Councillor Sargent, if I can be honest, is that I think that we had perhaps not worked as well with the civil servants as we could have in the early days. So we were providing information to them which we thought was satisfying them without realising that it wasn't satisfying their criteria. And so I think there are lessons to be learned for the way officers work with civil servants, and we have agreed that we will have regular ongoing meetings with them in order to ensure that we work more effectively with them. What I'm saying by this is that we have done a level of self-examination already, I think, in relation to this, and we have in this latest report tried to be as clear as possible about where we are with the housing delivery of that affordable housing programme, and clearly the board will want to ask a number of questions around that. If you want, of course, to take a deep dive review, perhaps through your internal auditor, and have a look at the affordable housing programme, then of course that's a matter for this committee. As you know, there were a number of attempts made through motions directly to the board just before the elections, which asked for something similar, which the board at that time didn't want to do. You may want to consider whether you make a further request of the board that there ought to be, or you ought to, your internal audit team want to have a look at and learn the lessons from where we could do better if we are delivering these in the future. That's a matter really for discussion amongst the committee members. I can't offer any assurance about what we can do going forward. Of course, we know now, as I've said previously, that we're in a bidding, we're in a process of competitive bidding with other councils and other combined authorities for funding. And we are preparing our best case for future funding of affordable housing for our area. And as you know, the Mayor is very supportive of a continued affordable housing programme, as is the Housing Committee, as expressed at their last committee. So we have a programme as to how we're going to, that we would like to put forward, or the early stages of a programme, but we don't know yet whether funding will be available to support any future affordable housing programme. I think, does that answer your question, Councillor Sargent? Is there anything you'd like to come back on?
No, I mean, I was encouraging you, if you'd like to give a bit of an update on that, but I mean, certainly in terms of the work programme, I think there were systemic issues in terms of housing and also the operation of the Housing Committee. So I think in terms of looking in terms of governance, in terms of the effectiveness of committees, that's the one I would prioritise, because there were major issues and I would like to put that onto the work programme.
Could I, in fact, I think that's a really good point, Councillor Sargent, and if I could ask you where you think those issues were, if we could put those into the governance review when we look at the Housing Committee and the operation of the Housing Committee, I think that would add real benefit to the governance review, so grateful to receive that.
Okay.
So it's an invitation for Councillor to let Rob have some issues which can be considered in that regard in the governance.
Or perhaps a meeting, Councillor Sargent, between Rob and I with you to have a look at some of those issues and put them into the governance review.
Well, I think it would be useful if John's involved as well.
Yep. Okay. So we take that as the next step on that topic, unless anybody's got any other comments to relate to it, or are there other comments on Kim's update?
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to leave. I've got another meeting at Fenland. I need to get back to that, so I'll have to leave. Thank you all for this morning.
Thanks very much, Ian.
Thank you.
David, you had a comment?
Yeah, thanks, Chairman. Thanks, Kim. You mentioned CAM and the, I couldn't actually see it in the board papers for next week, the alternative or not, as the case may be. From a governance issue, I'd like to understand really what's the process whereby the Mayor would appear to have stopped a programme that has been a key plank of combined authority. I would like to understand how that actually happens, because it doesn't appear to me to have gone to a transport committee or the board or anything, and yet what's being reported in the press is work has stopped.
Yes, I think if I could come back, I think this is what the overall CAM programme hasn't stopped. I think this is perhaps a little bit of semantics in the way it's been described, but the overall CAM programme hasn't stopped, and the Mayor doesn't have authority to stop the CAM programme. That is a matter for the Combined Authority Board. But clearly, the Mayor gave a number of manifesto commitments around the future of transport for this area. So when the Mayor arrived in the Combined Authority, of course, one of the things he wanted to do straight away was have a look at the CAM programme, and he invited the members, the Chair, Lord Robert Mayor of the One CAM board, to come in and talk to him about the future of transport for our area. And as a result of which, given the strength of feeling by the Mayor about the CAM programme and his different views about where we ought to put our transport priorities in the future, there was a decision made that we perhaps ought to just, we had issued a number of task orders which were ongoing with consultants to develop the early stages of the CAM business case. What we did is I took the decision to step down those task orders in the early stages, because we were spending in the region of 300 to 350,000 a month on those consultants, and given that the discussions had been had between the One CAM Limited Board and the Mayor, and also I knew that there would be therefore an impending board decision which is actually coming in July. I thought it wise to step down operational work on the programme until that decision could be taken by the board about whether or not they wanted to proceed. But the whole of the framework for the CAM programme is still in position at this point in time. So it's not stopped, but it's not going ahead either. It's almost in stasis, as it were. So the Mayor hasn't taken any decision to stop work. I think there was some misreporting around that. What I've done is actually slowed down what work was going on in order to ensure that the board had time to make the decision about where they wanted to go with a future transport strategy for our area. And I'm quite perfectly happy with that decision. I think it was the right decision to make, given where we were at the circumstances.
Any other? Jenny?
With the change of the funding coming through on the Lep and the business board, what's the potential impact on the effectiveness of the business board on the activities that they would like to achieve if the funding isn't delivered?
Yes, and that is I think the $64 million question that nobody knows at this stage, because the Lep review hasn't concluded. and therefore we don't know what they are envisaging for our future. With the OpsCams ARC in our area as well, we could have a different variation to other places in the area. So I don't know is the answer. But clearly, what I think we have found, because you remember in the early days of the Combined Authority, we had the GCGP Lep, and we made the decision that was bringing, it had a lot of, there was a National Audit Office report around it and a lot of concern about it. So we took the decision to take it apart and rebuild our Lep. And what we built was our business board, and we built it differently to every other Lep because we focused it on the business needs of our area. It only has 2 political representatives on the whole of the business board. And so it's got a very, very business focus, but it has a partnership link to Combined Authority because the Lep chair is on our board. And also all of the decisions of the business board come to the Combined Authority so that they can monitor and see how the funding is being spent. And actually that's worked really effectively because it's enabled business to have a voice in how we take forward all of our traditional public sector functions around housing, around transport, so that it joins up that business and make sure that voice is really heard in what we do. We are keen and we are making representations to government. We would very much like that to continue. So we understand that even though they may not be in future dishing out funds in the way they have been in the past, nonetheless, it's still an important part of the fabric of a Combined Authority, especially when you're dealing with economic recovery in a post-COVID world, because the people that you want advising you are your local businesses who are telling you where best to place all of your time and efforts as you move forward. So it's still to be determined, but we see a lot of value in it, is the summary.
Thank you, Kim.
Thank you.
So one action arising out of all of that is a 4-way discussion on the governance of lessons learned from the housing. Good, so that does take us onto the work programme. If I could head that, I think we should take a view once we've met in 4 ways. So could we leave adding anything on housing until the next meeting, please?
John, just as long as we pick up the point really that Kim's making in her report about the number of reports, how long the reports are, etc., and that obviously overlaps with the executive committee. So it's not just about the housing one. That's a good example, if you like. But how the executive committees operate, I think, is
okay. Well, and that's the function of your governance review. Yes. So actually, what we're asking is we need to see the outcome of that at a suitable stage on our agenda. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay. So can we put that onto the work plan? Has anybody got any other comments on the work plan as in the documents? We've got 2 development sessions in the time ahead, and I wondered what people felt that at the end of this year, in the March meeting, I mean, municipal guidelines, those of us who were in the induction yesterday, was the SIP for guidance on how we're doing as an audit committee, and the comments we've had today about how do you not just do what we did last year but move forward, whether we should have a development session at the end in March where we could look at how do we're performing and some self-assessment and to inform the year ahead. Would people be happy to see that as a development session? Okay, and that will give our new colleagues who would have had a year under their belt to see it as it is. Okay, that brings us.
Sorry, John, can I just ask, in terms of the development session on trading companies, rather than me having to surf through all the various board reports, etc., it'd be useful if somebody could pull together information on how the trading companies are constituted at the moment, so we've got some light reading for the summer before we meet in September.
Well, yes, and we've got the internal auditors looking at that. So before the development session, if I could have officers to make sure we have some briefing to think about before we go. But it's development session is euphemism for training session. Really.
I understand that, but
it's
you know,
like
I have seen how these have been constituted, but I just want to save myself a bit of time.
Okay. Am I able to do that? That's good. Thank you. So we've been 2 hours 40. We seem to run between 2 hours and 3 hours for these meetings. I think it is very much up to ourselves, the speed of advance. I think today has been particularly important that we've had all the discussion because it's the beginning of the new year. So anyway, at 12:42, I will call our first meeting closed. Thank you very much, everybody. Oh, and we are meeting here again on the 30th.